Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. So, today's topic is going to be the economy and reproduction. I think you'll find it interesting how reproduction and sexuality can actually be affected by economic factors. But before I go on, I'm going to make a plug for my recent science fiction novel. If you're into something that delves into ancient bloodlines and conspiracies, as well as alternative history, as in what was life back, around Noah's era? Did he live in a mud hut? Or perhaps things were a little bit more advanced than we might think. So anyway, if you're into, delving into those kinds of strange or, I'm just going to leave it at that, just kind of the strange conspiracy linked with science fiction type of plots, then check out my book, The Destiny of Our Past. You can check that out on a lot of venues, but of course easiest I think is Amazon. So just look it up, The Destiny of Our Past. So anyway, I'd like to point out something that really, I'm not doing this from a socialist point of view, first of all. Okay? I'm just going to present some facts here. The interpretation of them could be something that could be taken to support any variety of economic models. But I'm just going to say that I think that today's form of consumeristic capitalism is not good for the family, it's not good for culture, and it's not good for reproduction. Now you're probably thinking, whoa, what are you talking about? Well, I'm going to go into this and basically say this. I think in our society, we've gotten to a level where we've forgotten a lot of the social institutions that used to put a leash, for instance, on our greed and our sense that everything is based on economic gain and social status and so forth. Some of those institutions, for instance, religion. We don't have that same idea. In fact, in many ways you could say religion has been co-opted. I would actually say that socioculturally, the at least mainstream Protestant religion in America, and most certainly in Europe, was co-opted in like the 1950s and into the 1960s. It was a little sooner in Europe and a little bit later in the United States, but more that it was socially put into a situation that the idea that kindness and forgiveness and understanding, which are actually Christian virtues, have been used to bring in a lot of things that are not necessarily in accordance with the Bible. So in other words, we're so nice that things start getting brought in that might not totally be in accordance with the religion itself. And you could say that even though I don't think you could find things in Scripture that would actually say that you're supposed to be mean to people, there is a level that it can go into, well, everything's okay. All right? Now, for instance, I've heard people say that it's okay to be an atheist, and because you're going to go to heaven anyway. Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what the Bible says. I actually personally would hope that that was the case, that there could be some sort of allowances made for people's understanding. But nevertheless, I'm just saying that socio and cultural norms that were more fitting for maybe what we could call liberal society have been grasped onto by many Christian denominations. Now, if you're talking about economics, oh my gosh, the 1980s was when, basically religion became full-scale consumerism. The idea, it was even, I heard this a lot in the 80s and in the early 90s, and I think it actually might still be out there, this whole idea that if you're righteous, you should be wealthy. Because if you claim it, you can get it. Now, that also kind of implies that if you're poor, then you're unrighteous, even though you may be a really nice person. You may be a person that really strives to do good for others, and so forth. You might actually feel like, okay, something's wrong in my life because I don't live in the most expensive part of town, and so forth. Now, there's a cultural thing aside from religion that has come into capitalism, and why it's hurt perhaps young families from even getting started. And it's a notion that we should be at least at the level of our families. Now, here's the problem here's the problem we have. Let's say you're 10 years old and you start noticing the home you live in, the things you get for Christmas, and these kinds of things. Okay, well, that sets a certain norm. When you're 3 years old, you don't care if you know where you live. Okay, you can still, if you don't get anything for Christmas, you can find a box or something to play with, and you're okay when you're 3. When you get a little older, maybe 10 years old, it starts turning a little bit different, especially in our society today, which I'll get to. But think of it this way. When you're growing up, you don't remember when you were 3, and your mom may have had to give you a bath. I knew people like this when I was a kid, and I felt sorry for them. But then later I saw that they had nice homes. A couple families where they had to give baths to their children in the kitchen sink because they didn't have a bathtub in their house or trailer or something like that. And the thing is, you don't remember that when you're 3. You certainly would remember having to take a bath in a sink when you're 10. But what happens is, this family I'm telling you about in particular, they may have gotten married, then started a family a couple years later, and been saving their money up. And by the time the kid was 3, well, they've been married 5-6 years. When they started out, they didn't even have the trailer that they were living in. Remember those old Airstreams? They kind of, oh gosh, if you can even describe them, they weren't the mobile homes that they show you when the tornado comes through into somewhere in the South. I mean, these old Airstreams are trailers that people actually lived in the 60s. Until they could get money together to afford down payment on a home, and they had a good source of income. The thing is, I'll venture to say that the kids from that family, when they reach their teenage years and late teens, and when they're in the dating scene, and when they're starting to think about who they might settle down with and get married to, well, the problem is that they think back when they were teenagers. They want someone who is at the same economic level as their parents were. And I'm talking, I know this is stereotypical, but really most women do want to marry someone who's at the same level they are at, or a little bit above, or a lot above for that matter. But you can ask a group of women, probably anywhere in Western society, would you, if you had a university degree, would you date someone who may have the same interest as you, but they don't make as much money? And you'll find some of them, even if they made as much money, they wouldn't want to date a guy that doesn't have the same university background. And others, they'll say, well, I don't think I'd want to be supporting the guy. Okay, so they're thinking about when their parents also were fairly well-to-do. And that also goes through the guy's head. The guy's starting to think, well, I've got to be able to say, well, we can move into a home, and we can do this, and we can do this, and this, and this. Now, back in the 1960s, really all you needed was a good work ethic. You show up to work. Sometimes it didn't take much job training. And you could have a job in which you were making good money, right off the start. So if you were a responsible person, you didn't skip work, you didn't show up late, and you put in good work when you were there, you could expect job security, and you could expect to have an income that you could at least afford a home. Okay? You wouldn't be living in an Airstream trailer necessarily, but you could afford a home. And that's not the case anymore. And now housing prices have gone up for a variety of reasons, but one of them actually is that when you sell a house, you sell it for as much as you can get for it. That means that, when I hear these things saying, oh yeah, the economy's booming right now, housing prices have never been more expensive. Well, that's great news if you're selling a house. It's horrible, or refinancing a house. It's horrible news if you're a young couple wanting to buy a home, because that means you may not be able to afford to get a home. And the longer you wait if you are married and to get a home, you're probably around the same age as each other. Usually, most of the time, a guy's about 2-3 years older than the wife, but it's still pretty much the same age range. Well, the longer you wait, fertility, biology doesn't wait. Fertility decreases as you get older. And that can actually be a negative thing if housing prices are such that your expectation is set on having the same quality of life that mom and dad had, and you can't have that level of life, then you may put off having kids. Or what's being shown in today's society is you may not even get married. Young men still have this idea that when they get married, they want to bring something to the marriage where they can say, okay, there's stability here. Now, you can say that's their own fault. They should get with the times and not rely on this old notion that the guy has to earn more money or so forth. But you see, it doesn't matter what you say. If women still have the idea that, well, I want a guy who has at least the same economic level as I do, if men have the idea of, well, I'm not going to get married when I don't have the economy to do so, then you're talking about people living in separate homes, not getting together, putting it off. And you see now that the birth rate and marriage rate has been most decimated, and I do mean decimated, amongst lower middle class people from lower middle class backgrounds. And when I say lower middle class, I'm not necessarily talking about people who are living in those trailer courts. Okay? Lower middle class, I'm talking about people that may have modest, been raised in modest houses. Dad worked full-time, maybe mom worked half-time, or when she got older, full-time. And, not the kind of family where you're thinking, okay, for Christmas, let's go to Thailand or Belize or Jamaica or something like that. Christmas might be, well, maybe we get in the car and drive down to Disneyland if you live on the West Coast. And that group has been really hit hard. And you see that in how drug abuse has gone up horrendously amongst young white males primarily, and it's just not very good. Now you're thinking, well, it should be, the birth rate should be lower amongst the poorer people. No, that's not the case, because you see, the thing is, then we get back into expectations, and you could get into the idea that opportunity cost for someone who's grown up in a very poor environment in which maybe they are receiving public assistance of some sorts, and they didn't, have this idea that, oh, I've got to go to college, oh, I've got to get this job, I got to wait to get married until I am stable. That group, the opportunity cost for getting pregnant is not as great as for those who are more on that upward expectation scale. And so the poor, their birth rate has remained fairly constant, which is actually higher than, the middle class or the lower middle class or the upper middle class. The upper middle class, the birth rate is relatively constant. I mean, if the upper middle class, you know that when you go to college that dad's going to get you a job, with his friends or something like that, well, then there's not this fear of the unknown and the uncertainty of today's economy. But the lower middle class, who don't have those traditional safeguards and safety nets and that sort of thing, they make too much money to be able to qualify for any kind of public assistance, and they make too little money in order to really have economic independence. Well, that's going to hurt, and they're not going to get together. Even though you could argue that if people did get together, they would be stronger. They'd be pulling their two incomes together. They could start saving. And sometimes, as Nietzsche said, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. And so maybe, struggling is not a bad thing if you're doing it together. But that doesn't happen in today's consumeristic society. Especially, that's not the message you're going to get. You're not going to get it from the sellout churches, who are going to be basically just reinforcing whatever cultural norms that exist within the United States today. You're not going to get it from the media that makes its money off selling goods and trips and fantasy lifestyles as if they're the necessities of life. Okay, so really, we've got a situation where it's no wonder that so many young men are turning to negative lifestyles and hurting themselves in the process, or even giving up on the whole concept of marriage and family and so forth. That's very interesting. When I was in college, I was listening to a documentary about Hungary. And this was back when Hungary was still a communist nation. And a survey was done amongst women as to what was the 5 things you find most attractive in a man that you were considering marriage to. And they listed, I can't remember all the details, but they listed like sense of humor, nice personality, those kinds of things. But not economic level, not how much money they made, not their profession. Because in a communist country, it's like everyone's kind of equal anyway. So there is, unless you're really into politics and you want to climb the political social hierarchy, which, of course, in a communist nation can be extremely Machiavellian, and therefore, you either can make it big or you might disappear. Pretty much things are kind of like, okay. Now, it doesn't say the lifestyle was good. Of course, if there's this kind of stagnation, the expectations may not be as high, but then there's in the communist countries, there was rampant alcoholism and those kinds of things as a form of escapism. But when communism fell, it just took a few years that they did these surveys again and found that the man's economic level had crept into the 5 top, things that you were looking for. I think it's actually number 1 or number 2. Of course, most of the time you don't want to look like you're totally consumed with economic pride. So therefore, you're going to say, "Oh, he has to have a great personality and a good job." So you're not going to say he's got to have a good job first. And, that is kind of, telling of where societies go in a capitalistic mode. Unless you have something that offsets it again. All right? Now, in Russia, you've got, Vladimir Putin, who often makes references both to religion, but also to national pride. The idea that we should have families in order to preserve Russian culture and those kinds of things. You don't really see that so much in Western countries. But, whether it's Russia with Putin or Turkey, same thing. Erdogan, who has said the same thing about the average Turkish woman should shoot for 3 children per family. And they can use the national pride in order to promote that. But you don't really see that nowadays. So there's a lot of these forces marshaled against reproduction. And also you throw in the idea that children could cost you money and so forth. And all of a sudden you've got all these negatives without seeing the positives. And of course, that's going to lower the birth rate. Even for the ones who are married, it's going to lower the marriage rate, because nowadays you got all kinds of substitutes too. How much does porn cost anyone? It's free. How much does going to a singles bar and lying about yourself and making yourself seem larger than life, and then going home with someone and spending the night, and you never see each other again? Unless you catch a disease or something like that. Well, you won't see them again, but you might have some of the residue from whatever you picked up having relations with a stranger. But the thing is that we have all these substitutes, and that is going to really bring down our marriage and reproduction rate unless something changes. Now, as I was saying, religion could make a difference. All right, but I don't even know if it really does there too, because a lot of the religious people you see their mansions and their cars and all this kind of stuff, and there is an expectation that maybe still young people see kind of like, okay, well, I can't get to that life, and I certainly can't get it when I'm tied down to another person. So they opt out. And if that religious leader doesn't talk about things like family and marriage and having babies, I mean, it's ridiculous. I've seen some of these televangelists get on, and I'm not including Pat Robertson, because I've actually seen some stuff where Pat Robertson's talked about birth rates and stuff like that. But some of these televangelists will get on and say, well, that part of the Bible that talks about be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, that could actually apply to missionary work. Well, I'm sorry. When that scripture was given to Noah and to and Adam, there weren't a lot of people to do missionary work around. Now, was there? Okay, so obviously this has 0% to do with doing missionary work in the world and doing good. It means ultimately making babies. Sorry, that's just the way it is. But you know what? That's politically incorrect to say nowadays, even amongst religious people. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, and you're real back there in the old days or something like that. Well, I've said it before on shows. I think the average Christian today would be considered a humanist, secular humanist, if they went back through time, maybe 60, 70 years, and walked into a church and started talking. They'd be like, why are you here? Shouldn't you be down at some sort of party function at some campus or something like that? So ultimately, I think that capitalism is not really helping the family right now. And of course, I'm not saying we should have communism. I'm not saying that we should suddenly, create a system that they may have had during the Soviet era where they tried to get people to have kids. Of course, the irony was, in a communist system, you don't generate a lot of economy, and therefore the homes that most people had in Russia were these little tiny apartments that, your government could be giving you all kinds of bonuses to have big families, but if your apartment is the size of the apartment that you may have had when you were going to college, then it's a little difficult to be thinking having 3 or 4 kids. So the average Russian woman had, in the urban areas, they might have had 1, a little bit more than 1. And in the rural areas, they may have had, 2 or 3, which gave you roughly an equivalent to 2 children per family, average. If you, averaged in the non-Russian areas down in the Caucasus Mountains that were more Islamic, at least in tradition. But when the supports did go away, when communism did fall, the birth rate in Russia and Eastern Europe just collapsed. It's kind of growing again, but it's nowhere near what it was during the communist era. Because now you've got a generation that's coming up and they're watching TV and they're getting these high expectations and this is what I want in life, and they're getting married later just as they are here. And the later someone gets married, it's interesting because the later you go, the less it seems important to do so. think about it. When a person's like 20 and they're not married, there's still this sense of, oh my gosh, am I going to get married? It's going through their minds. And they're kind of like, okay, well, there's still a pretty good market for people out there. Economic terms. There's still a good market out there. Lots of available people, but that starts to decrease. But then if you start reaching, especially for women, if you start reaching like your late 20s or early 30s, you're thinking, maybe I don't need to get married. And that's creeping in here. So later marriages actually do decrease the birth rate. The interesting thing is, the more you keep a woman distracted and unmarried during her fertile years, you've got a huge advantage there with reducing the birth rate, which is something that a lot of the, kind of the elite want to do to the developed countries is, no, the birth rate's really low. Let's get it lower. And the thing is that these, if I was reading about a movie star a while back, and she was so busy with a hit series that she was on that she didn't have a chance to have kids. Now she's, of course, past the age of having kids, and that's it. And so I think I remember back in the days when the really big push for population control in like Asia, someone was saying, when someone chooses to have a boy over a girl, then that means that when they grow up, they're not going to reproduce. I mean, not as much. A girl can have kids even when she's single, but a guy can't. So again, it's kind of this distraction and so forth. Keep people occupied doing this, that, or whatever during their young years. And then when they start reaching 34, 35, and they're going, wait a minute, the biological clock is ticking. Well, it may just run out before time is up, at least for women. But generally speaking, men marry women that are about the same age as they are, unless actually the interesting thing is either the very rich or the very poor. The very poor, there's not as big of concern with such things as normal middle class or economic middle class lifestyle. So you will see situations where a man can be 20 or 30 years older than his wife, and it's more socially acceptable in those circles. The middle class is like, no, this is what I watch on TV, and this is how I've been programmed to believe, so we got to keep up appearances. Not to borrow from a TV show from Britain a few years ago. And the rich, well, they don't care either. The rich could not care less what the middle class thinks of them. All right, and that's why you have situations in which sometimes it gets out of control, as we see with Hollywood. But at the same time, we almost expect movie stars to be, at least male leading role movie stars to be 30 years older than their wives. So again, that doesn't make as huge a difference. Now, what can we do to get, I've been talking about all this like, woe is us, we're going to just kind of become an old population and just wither away and die. No, I think there's things that could be done. First of all, I think we need to get back to authenticity when it comes to religion. People need to actually evaluate, is the religion they're in promoting the values that they believe in? A lot of people nowadays, I don't care what you think about when it comes to politics, when it comes to Trump or Hillary or anything like that. But you see what's happening with big sports? That people are not tuning in as much. Movies and TV series are getting a lot less views now, less people wanting to see them. And I think a lot of it is that people are starting to kind of go, you know what? People up there at the top really don't reflect my values anymore. And they start going, well, if they don't reflect my values, why am I supporting them economically? Well, that's a good question. And maybe people should ask that when it comes to the religions. If you belong to a church in which your pastor gets up and he talks about kind of a feel good and all this kind of stuff, but you don't hear so much about the importance, the vital importance of family and commitment and marriage and childbearing, what's he up there for? I mean, seriously. Seriously. You go to a lot of mainstream churches, which this has been the case for quite some time. And, I visited some during the 80s and 90s on various, events that were taking place. And you look out and there's like a sea of gray hair. They're dying. Versus you go to a conservative church and you'd see a lot of young people and families. But yet now they're getting polluted as well. Maybe they're 20 years behind the times, but, times catch up. All right? So that's a danger. We need to get back to authenticity when it comes to a religion. Now, is this saying, if you're not religious, that you can't, also be concerned with this? No. I mean, there is a direct correlation seen, or at least an inverse relationship between religion and birth rates. In other words, people that have low levels of religion tend to have very low birth rates, whereas people with higher religion tend to have higher birth rates. But I think you're going to see an intersection there, because many of the people that were in religions that were not scared, maybe back in the 80s and 90s, to say, hey, people should have kids, that sort of thing. Well, they're not saying that so much anymore, so their birth rates are going down. And you're going to see that, again, vitality is going to be less, and you're going to see a shrinkage amongst the young people in those religions. And the youth are what makes a society. You can have 100,000 old people on an island and think, hey, we got a pretty good population. But in about 30, 40, 50 years, it'll be zero. Okay, you've got to have young people in your society in order to have a society that will continue. Unless, of course, you want to go out there and invent some sort of nanotechnology, which will keep us alive, forever. I haven't seen that yet. If you have some, if you know someone that's created it, let me know, because I'd kind of like to have it. But the thing is that we need to start promoting the idea that if the values of the people that make our TV shows, do our movies, tend to dominate in higher education, all right, with their viewpoints, at least within the social sciences, if those people do not reflect the values that keep societies going, and they don't reflect the values that we are supposed to have, then why do we listen to them? Why not disconnect? Maybe it's time for a new hippie era. And I don't mean you have to grow your hair out and wear sandals, okay? But that kind of mentality that says, I don't care what the norms are anymore. Throw the norms out. And also, when it comes to the idea of what we prioritize, remember, if we're prioritizing what's right, then maybe such things as, well, no, we can't get married until we have this level of money, and we can't have children certainly until we have this level of money. Maybe that's, maybe 30 years from now, you're going to look back going, why didn't we do it differently? Now it's too late. Okay, now it's too late. You can't go back. You can't go back and say, and I've known many people in their 50s and 60s who've said, oh my gosh, I had 2 kids. I wish I'd had 3 or 4. I wish I could go back. I wish. I knew a woman who felt so compelled by trying to save the world that when she found out she was pregnant with her 3rd child, she had an abortion and got sterilized because she was so scared of what other people would think of them being so selfish and having more kids. But remember, when you're past that, when you're past those, if you're a woman, you're past those times when those ovaries are shooting out, healthy eggs, and your body can't, wouldn't be able to carry very easily anyway. If you were past, that age period, then maybe, there's time to reflect upon it now and think, what is going to be the most important thing to me when I'm 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90? And the same is true for men. Because, again, most men marry people that are within their age group. So, I don't care if your sperm's going to be healthy until you're 50, 60, or 70 years old. It doesn't matter. Because if you're married to someone who's 50, 60, 70 years old, then, that's just academic. All right? So we can't become the victims of this kind of glamour and glitz that we get on our commercials and we get from Hollywood. By the way, just remember the people that make our Hollywood films. Think about the headlines today. Are they really good? And they're telling us what to think and how to think. We can't let the consumeristic society to determine how we live our lives. Okay, it's just not going to work. All right, for the long run, a society based on our consumeristic ideals and expectations today might be wealthy for a while, but then it collapses. And that wealth that you built up is going to be worthless. Just as worthless, when you walk through a ghost town, okay, you walk into a ghost town and you're thinking, one time, this used to be a city. There used to be people who made their livings here. There used to be people that went to school here, and now it's gone. It's dead. There's nothing that says that our society won't be the same way in the future. All right? And even if our society continues, we still have the same buildings and roads and bridges and so forth. Your family might just die out. And is that worth it? Is it worth it for guys to sit there and go, I'm going to go MGTOW? And women women suck, and I'm not going to have any relationships with them. Well, I'm sorry, you're also not going to pass on your genes, and your family's going to go extinct. All right? This is one of the reasons why I say maybe we should consider polygamy. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are just going to give up. Maybe you take up the slack there, from other guys. I mean, it can't be that all women have to just go to sperm banks and have families. So anyway, these are just some thoughts to consider. And remember that everything is economic. All right? Our economy and ultimately our biology is based on economics. But there are other factors that do and must be considered. I'm just going to make a play.